Alright, YouTube, what's up? This is your boy Alex. I'm back. It's Monday, and got another Smash Mouth football video for you. This one's going to be a very interesting one. This one I had to really carefully look at and put together. It's going to be San Francisco 49er, three-time Super Bowl champion, two-time MVP, Steve Young. Now, Steve Young's a very interesting case. He's not like all the other football players on this list. Now, he did play college football, and then for whatever reason, like most young guys, he wanted in the NFL, but they had this rule back, I think, in the 80s. You had to at least do a year or 2 years of college football, and then if you're in college, you have to do at least a year or 2 years before you can go pro. And he felt he was so talented at the time, he didn't want to do college football. He wanted pro. So he ended up signing with the Los Angeles Express in the UFL Football League, where he played about 2.5 years with them. And he showed that he could run the football, he could throw the football, he could play multiple positions, and he could run anywhere from 20 to like 50 yards. And then at his absolute best, he could run 100 plus yards. And he was good at throwing the football, and he was real good at stealing the football and passing it off. And if he had to, he could run into the end zone. And he was like 6'1", 6'2", 220 pounds, and he could play. Like, he could actually play. But, however, there was a money dispute. It seems like that always happens when you go to another league that's not the NFL. And he couldn't take it, so he ended up playing Canadian football, because it was 1984, and by the time it loomed to 1987, he had already been playing pretty much 5 years of professional football, but he wasn't getting the money that he deserved. He felt he wasn't getting enough playing time, and finally it wasn't until 1989, 1990 that he was able to get looked at by the NFL, and he had to go into a draft. You know, he wanted to play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They thought it was going to be a bust, and he got passed over, and he ended up being a pick in 1989, and nothing happened. And then he tried again in 1990, nothing happened. And then finally in 1991, he had been selected to the San Francisco 49ers. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, he was better known as the Joe Montana backup, which I think very behind the scenes in his private moments, I think it angered him. I think it frustrated him that to have to play anywhere from 5 to like 7.5 years of professional football in 3 different leagues. You finally make it to the NFL, finally, like at the tender age of 24, 25, somewhere in there. You finally make it to the NFL, and you get deemed as the backup. And the same thing that happened with Tom Brady and the other football player, Joe Montana went down with an injury after 5 or 6, 7 games in the season, and he basically convinced the coach to let him come in the game, which they reluctantly did. They didn't think he was going to be any good prospect, and he took a 49er team that was down 20 points and rallied them back with 5 touchdowns, and they won the football game. And Joe Montana was out for, I think, 2 more games after that. And in the 3 games, they won all 3 games by a huge margin. You know, he put up superb numbers. And then he got put back on the bench. And then it wasn't until they won a championship with both quarterbacks that they began to realize he might be their future, but they weren't certain. And then, of course, they lost on their way to the Super Bowl. And then, of course, we get to 1994, they win another championship, because there's 91, then there's 93. They lost it. I mean, they won 91. either 91 or 92. They lost 93. They made it back to the 1994 Super Bowl, so that gave him 2 championships. But even though he won 2 championships and he was putting up superstar numbers, he still had a hard time accepting the fact that they were still making him becoming the backup to Joe Montana. So it's not until 94 when they won their 3rd championship um, that they finally had to make a decision after winning 3 championships, because you had Jerry Rice on this team, you had Joe Montana, you had Steve Young, and there's 2 other players, but you had this squad, and he basically, he got blamed in the media for being responsible for getting rid of Joe Montana, because at this point he was like 27 or 28, going on 29, and he kind of said, hey, I've been here, I won 3 championships, I'm a 2-time MVP, I'm the best player of the game, and why am I still taking a back seat? And they finally said, you're right, you're absolutely right. He did take the 49ers back to the Super Bowl to see if he could win 4 championships, but they would lose because by this time period they had an injured roster, and Deion Sanders was holding them out for money. 3 other players was holding out for money. 2 players got traded, and then their replacements weren't as good, and then he just basically was just trying to lead this team back to glory. And then, they fired the coach, and, he had a good relationship with the coach, but they fired the coach, and by 97-98 season, they made the playoffs again. And all 5 years after, during that time, he would make the playoffs. It wasn't until 98-99 that Joe Montana would leave, but every now and then, they would switch the rotation. If it was home games, Joe Montana's the quarterback. On the road, Steve Young was the quarterback, and Steve Young started to get a little irritated, like, come on, man, at some point, you got to let me be the star for once. And when they got rid of Joe Montana, finally when they got rid of him in the final year that he was gone, the San Francisco 49ers made it to the playoffs. They won a playoff game, and you know what happened. They would lose to the Green Bay Packers. But at this point, Steve Young was now 33, and he was injured. Like, he was actually injured. And he had to set out. And someone else had to play. And the quarterback that replaced him couldn't do none of the stuff that he and Joe Montana would do. And he wanted to play injured. And they were afraid if he played injured, which did actually happen, they would lose. And you could see in the 99-2000 season, the 49ers failed to make the playoffs. And he was then, it would finish out his career, try to sign and demand a trade. It probably didn't follow through. And you can see how his career started. Now, Brett Favre. Brett Favre is an interesting guy, too, because he started his career in Atlanta. He got drafted to the Atlanta Falcons. And when he was with the Atlanta Falcons, he basically was a guy that, he was goofy, he was immature, and he wasn't serious about making the commitment. But during the 3-year, I would say 4 years and 5 months, that's almost 5 years that he played with the team, they traded him because they just couldn't deal with his immatureness. And they sent him to Green Bay. And it's not until Brett Favre got like around 24, 25 years old that he started to get seasons with experience. Now, he played high school football. He played for a college called Southern Mississippi. Southern Miss is its nickname. And he found himself in the NFL. And like the story goes, they would always mess up his name. He would always have to correct people his name. And they would always still mess his name up. Anyway, when he got to Green Bay, he took a team that hadn't made the playoffs in almost 10 years or something like that, and took them to a place where they hadn't been. All of a sudden, he won 1 game. And I remember when I was a kid, they said it was luck, because it's just 1 game where they were down by 25 points, and he rallied a comeback, and I think he beat I can't remember if it was the Rams or the Chargers or the Chicago Bears. It was one of those three teams, but they were down by a big margin, and he rallied back with 7 touchdowns in a row, and it shocked everyone. And then he won 2 games, 3 games, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Before you know it, he won 9 games in the season, and they were still calling it luck his first season, and they would predict he would lose his first playoff game, and they made the playoffs, and I can't remember who they played in their first game, but they won, and it's not until they got to their second playoff game that they would lose, and it was primarily because he was battling injuries. And in the second year, they would make the playoffs for the second year in a row. They would again get eliminated. 3 years in a row, they would keep getting eliminated by the Dallas Cowboys. So every time they try to do this, they would just keep losing. And it's not until the 4th year that they finally beat the Dallas Cowboys, and then they got to the second round, and then they knocked off San Francisco, and then they got to the third game, and then they lost the third game. And it's not until he was like 27 going 28 that he caught fire. You know, they got Reggie Wright, and not yet, but he was on his way. And then he went to his first Super Bowl, and he lost. And then he wouldn't go to another Super Bowl for another 2 more seasons. By the time he was 30, he finally gone to a second Super Bowl, and he finally won. And by this time period, it had now been 11 years in his football career that he had finally done what critics said would never happen. He won a Super Bowl championship. He won MVP. He won Most Valuable Player in the season and in the Super Bowl. He put up superstar numbers in the season, but put up legendary numbers in the Super Bowl. And when he done this, it proved that he was vindicated. It took 11 years, but he finally done it. And then finally, he too would have the same problem like Steve Young. By the time it was now 14 years in his career, they had now drafted a player by the name of Aaron Rodgers, who was a young up-and-coming quarterback. And Brett Favre was now like 37 or 38 at the time, and began to realize that they were looking up to him as the more option to win football games. Same situation. You know, it's the hometown kid versus the new kid on the block. And Brett Favre wasn't really ready to leave Green Bay. And a decision was made. After 16 years of playing with the Green Bay Packers, he got dealt and sent to, the Minnesota Vikings. And he proved even in his late 30s, going into his 40s, that he could take that team to the playoffs. And he would play against his former Green Bay Packer team twice in the season. The first match, surprise, surprise, he would win. And of course, Green Bay would win the second one. He would play 2 seasons with the Vikings, and then he would turn around, and then I think for his final season, he played with the New York Jets. And again, he took that team to the playoffs. And once again, I think at 39 or 40, he proved once again that he still could play after all these years have passed by. And to see him have to compete with guys that are now considered the new players. He was competing against Tom Brady. He would surprisingly actually win 1 or 2 matchups against a young Tom Brady, which people were shocked of. Let's see, he went up against Peyton Manning, Eli Manning. There were guys like Terrell Owens. He was going against all these newer players. Cam Newton had came, Patrick Willis, and Russell Wilson. He had an incredible shootout with them. Like, I remember he commented about how he thought some of these younger players will eventually win a championship. It was a shock that he could compete with some of these younger men that were like 11 years younger than him. And even when he was supposed to be in the twilight of his career, he proved critics, no matter what happens, I'm still Brett Favre. And of course, he would retire, and that would be how his career would end. After 18 seasons, that was it. 18, 19 seasons. It was the longest in NFL recorded history. And we all know that's going to be surpassed by Tom Brady, of course. But you could see how he became a commentator, an analyst. And let's not forget, he popped up in movies, television shows, wrote a couple of books, commercials. And now he's a commentator and an analyst. And he has his own jean clothing line. And of course, he's done voiceover for the cartoon of The Simpsons. So he's the legendary Brett Favre. The only thing that's left is for them to turn his life story into a movie. I'm sure they probably would do it at this point. Now, who's better in their prime? Steve Young or Brett Favre? See, Brett Favre, when it came to the 49ers, he really had to prove himself. And for him to take on the man, the legend, Joe Montana, and beat him in devastating fashion, and then to see the passing of the torch. And there was some controversial because some people felt that Steve Young wanted the torch to be passed to him, and it was. If these two faced each other, hold on, every time I do a video, I swear every time I do a video, the house phone always calls. So like I was saying, in their primes, I would think by a slight margin, Brett Favre would probably beat him just because he had the better football team. He had the most experience. And the Green Bay Packers, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're faster. They can play on both sides of the ball, offense, defense. And you couldn't really trap Brett Favre because he was a big, strong guy. And when you did, he always had other options. He could throw the football before you could sack him. He would run it into the end zone, kind of similar to Ben Roethlisberger. And like Tom Brady, he has a sneaky hand that you don't know what direction the football is going to go when the wide receiver receives it. And if he had to, he'll run the clock out or tie it up and send it in overtime. With Steve Young, he was like a young shootout football player. He would shoot out the football game. If you took away all his other options, that would be the only way he would win. And then as he got older and he matured, he found better ways to win the football game instead of I'm just going to shoot out the football game. So I would probably say that if you're talking about champion versus champion, in terms of it, yes, Steve Young won 3 championships, but they always seem to want to give the credit to someone else, even though the reality is Steve Young actually did help that team win its championships because Joe Montana did help them win their first Super Bowl and their second Super Bowl, but it was Steve Young that helped them win the third Super Bowl, which gave him 3 championships and gave Joe Montana 4. If I'm not mistaken, I'll double check my math on that. But my point is, and Brett Favre gone to a Super Bowl twice, but we all know that had Brett Favre had matured faster and quicker, he probably would have won as many championships as Steve Young. So in their prime, if we're talking about championships, you would say Steve Young. But if you're talking about without the championships and you're talking about who really, really was good, you got to go with Brett Favre because even towards the end of his career, he could still play guys 11 years younger and still beat them. Despite the fact that they're bigger, stronger, faster. And after playing like 19 years, he still would take on a lot of these younger quarterbacks and beat them. Whereas Steve Young, towards the end of his career, he just had so many injuries that even when he did become the star of the 49ers and Joe Montana was gone, you could see that they replaced him too. So you could see that in the end, I would say by a slight hair, a slight margin, Brett Favre.